Hello and welcome to our BTC Network webinar. My name is Georgia and today we'll be talking about FDA and IRB inspections. Our webinars are designed to share information in the clinical research industry through a variety of topics. If you have any questions, please send them through the box on the right side of your screen. If time allows, we will have a short Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Any questions not answered will be addressed in a follow-up blog post. With us today, we have Joan Chambers, Chief Operating Officer at CenterWatch, Dominic Chiarelli, Manager of Legal and Regulatory Affairs at Kinetiq, and Terry Stubbs, President and CEO of ActivMed Practices and Research. So without further ado, here is Joan Chambers.
Thank you, Georgia, for the introductions. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on FDA and IRB inspections, what sites need to know. As Georgia mentioned, I will be the moderator for this webinar session. Dominic will present from the IRB perspective, and Terry will present from the site perspective. The clinical trial environment has several different stakeholders involved: principal investigators, sponsors, IRBs, the FDA, OHRP, institutions, and patients. As the industry continues to evolve with new regulations and expectations, it is critical for the principal investigators and the study staff to adhere to federal regulations while conducting and managing safe and ethical clinical trials. Today, the webinar will focus on these key discussion topics: FDA site inspection overview, a general overview of inspections, agency perspective, the authority, the enforcement options, a site perspective, what to do, how to prepare, and ending with key lessons learned and a question and answer section. To provide a brief high-level overview, since 2008, the industry has seen a relatively consistent level of OSI inspections conducted domestically and internationally. From fiscal year 2015, 147 inspections were conducted internationally, with only 33% stating voluntary action indicated and 66% with no action indicated. And just for reference, voluntary action indicated means objectionable conditions were found and documented, but the agency is not prepared to take or recommend regulatory action. And no action indicated is defined as meaning no objectionable conditions or practices were found during the inspection. Delving deeper, this slide depicts the clinical investigator deficiencies domestically and internationally. And as we see, protocols and records are the common deficiencies cited. Domestically, 23% and 14% for protocol and records respectively, and looking at foreign, 27% and 14% respectively. The positive news: the industry is making improvements on the inspection results received when we look at 2010 to 2015. 48% of NAI to 64% NAI. Sites are more readily prepared with the proper information sources and the resources to conduct and manage clinical trials. So again, the industry is seeing an improvement in this area. The other positive news is a decrease in the number of warning letters issued in 2015. We saw a run rate of high warning letters in 2009 with some improvement moving into 2010 and 2011, and really a significant decrease in 2015. This high-level overview provides a landscape of the importance of FDA IRB inspections to ensure that clinical investigators and the site staff are following the federal regulations and the federal requirements to ensure patient safety. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Dominic, who will present from the IRB perspective and offer key insights. After Dominic's presentation, he'll be able to introduce Terry's, who will present again on the site perspective. Thank you.
Yes, hello, thank you. Next slide, please. So the FDA's mission is to protect the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, and medical devices. As such, the FDA is essentially a consumer protection agency. It is in fact one of the first U.S. consumer protection agencies and traces its roots back to the 1800s and the sweeping challenges presented by new chemistry-based opportunities for modifying foods and producing medicines. The FDA has taken a circuitous path to its current predominance, in which the products it oversees account for 25% of every consumer dollar spent in the United States. The FDA's scope has broadened and deepened as it has moved from the U.S. Patent Office to the Department of Interior to the Department of Agriculture and to finally the Department of Health, where it resides today. Throughout this journey, the FDA's purpose, however, has largely stayed the same, using scientific principles to protect the public from unsafe commercial activities. It's important to note, and the FDA is also always careful to point out, that its purpose has never included regulating the practice of medicine, even if its activities influence the availability of products necessary to the medical trade. Next. The FDA derives its authority from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which for the first time required FDA approval prior to marketing a drug product after a significant public health crisis, the elixir sulfonamide disaster. Although the FDCA did not specify the kinds of testings that were required for approval, it did allow the FDA to block the marketing of a new drug or delay it by requiring additional data. The Act has been updated over time, most significantly in the 1960s with the Kefauver-Harris amendments after another significant public health scare involving free samples of the experimental drug thalidomide. These shifted the evidentiary burden for demonstrating safety through adequate and well-controlled experiments from the FDA to sponsors and add efficacy to the agency's pre-market review process. It also resulted in the promulgation of the investigational drug regulations, which created the infrastructure that we all work under today. In the 1970s, medical devices were also firmly pulled into the FDA's orbit with their own risk-based pre-market review process. The FDA's authority, however, remains far from unchecked, and the activities of the FDA generally must still pertain to ensuring only that medical products are safe and effective. For example, the FDA does not set or even consider drug prices, even though it's fundamentally a consumer protection agency. Next. One prominent means in which the FDA fulfills its purpose is through inspection of clinical investigators to assess compliance with the FDCA and its implementing regulations. The FDA routinely inspects IRBs, sponsors, CROs, and clinical investigators, each of whom has their own highly tailored compliance program and inspection standards. If an inspection identifies possible alleged noncompliance, the FDA can seek a range of administrative, civil, and even criminal actions to compel conformance. All domestic and foreign FDA inspections are run as part of the Bioresearch Monitoring Program, or BMO. BMO's responsibilities run across the agency and involves all of the different centers for medical products. Its stated primary purpose is ensuring the protection of subjects involved in clinical research involving FDA-regulated products and ensuring the quality and integrity of data in clinical studies that support research and marketing applications submitted for FDA review. BMO is run out of the FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs, which has approximately 5,000 employees and overall a much broader scope. In 2016, the Office of Regulatory Affairs conducted 40,000 inspections related to foods, tobacco, and medical products in 80 different countries that resulted in 14,000 warning letters, 8,000 recalled products, 17 injunctions, and 257 arrests. BMO inspections are generally assigned by the respective FDA center, so the Center for Biologics, the Center for Drugs, the Center for Devices, and may occasionally include participation by center personnel. BMO conducted 664 total clinical investigator inspections in 2016. Next. The FDA considers an inspection as a careful, critical, official examination of a facility to determine its compliance with the laws administered by the FDA. The kind and type of inspection conducted will normally be defined by the program, assignment, or supervisor, but generally falls into one of three types: comprehensive, directed, or routine. A comprehensive inspection will cover everything in the establishment subject to the FDA's jurisdiction. A directed inspection will cover only specific areas to the depth detailed in the compliance program and the particular assignment. A directed inspection is usually a for-cause audit due to a marking application, a complaint, or as a follow-up to a prior finding of noncompliance. A routine inspection is a type of directed inspection, but is considered basic surveillance and will not have any particular motivation or target other than assessing conformance with the compliance program. Routine inspections are intended to occur every other year, but in reality, they occur less frequently due to the FDA needing to prioritize its limited resources. The FDA will generally prioritize inspections based on their perceived merit, and as such tends to focus its efforts on the most risky or novel medical products, sites with prior findings, and interestingly, uninspected new facilities. Next. FDA enforcement activities come in three flavors: advisory, administrative, and judicial. An advisory activity is at the total discretion of the FDA, and compliance is voluntary. An administrative activity is not optional and usually results in the loss of a privilege managed by the FDA under the law. This may include the ability to conduct research, a clinical hold on a study, or withdrawal of approval of an IND. A judicial activity is also not optional and can include seizures, injunctions, and even criminal prosecution. We will focus mostly on the advisory and administrative activities, as these are most common to research sites. The advisory tools the FDA has at its disposal in order of gravity include inspectional observations, untitled letters, and warning letters. An inspectional observation is a list of observations made by the inspector on site, commonly referred to as a 483, which the inspector believes are nonconformities with FDA laws and regulations, and which is provided to the head of the establishment prior to concluding the inspection. These observations are incorporated into the inspector's establishment inspection report and provided to the local FDA district office for review within 3 business days, and will often form the basis of any subsequent FDA enforcement action. FDA policy indicates that if a response to a 483 is received within 15 working days of its issuance, the agency will consider this response in its decision regarding whether or not to take additional enforcement actions, and likely the issuance of a warning letter. In 2016, the FDA issued approximately 4,500 different 483s, with 215 of these coming from BMO, meaning directed towards clinical investigators. The most common findings for clinical site inspections were a failure to conduct the investigation in accordance with the investigational plan, a failure to prepare or maintain adequate case histories, failure to maintain or document informed consent, and inadequate investigational drug disposition records. The FDA may issue as well an untitled letter for any notable violation that does not meet the threshold of a significant violation. These letters allow recipients to take voluntary and prompt action to correct objectionable conditions before the FDA considers more serious enforcement activities. Untitled letters are not generally public and do not include a statement warning that failure to promptly correct the violation may result in additional enforcement action. It's essentially a warning letter light. FDA may elect to post an untitled letter to a center website if it determines it would inform the public, deter future violations, or it may receive multiple FOIA requests for that letter. A warning letter serves as formal notification that in the FDA's opinion, a clinical investigator has failed to comply with FDA laws and regulations and can only be issued by the district office with concurrence from the responsible FDA center. Warning letters are usually reserved for instances in which the FDA has observed repeated or serious deviations, and yet it's believed that the violations can be corrected through specific actions by the investigator, and that adherence to a corrective action plan has a high probability of preventing similar or other violations from occurring in the future. A warning letter serves 2 purposes. It allows a clinical investigator to achieve voluntary compliance, and it provides notice of additional possible legal actions if the clinical investigator fails to take corrective actions to remedy the conditions. That said, it should be known that the FDA is clear in its belief that it is under no legal obligation to warn individuals they are in violation of the law before taking an enforcement action. Consequently, an inspected site should not assume they must receive a warning letter or other prior notice before the FDA takes administrative or legal steps. Interestingly, however, the FDA also considers a warning letter to be informal and advisory only, which means it does not commit the agency to taking formal action, and this essentially prevents the site from having standing to sue the FDA preemptively if desired. In 2016, the FDA issued approximately 500 warning letters total, and 7 specifically to clinical investigators. Next. The FDA also has several administrative enforcement tools at the ready for more serious or persistent issues. This principally includes disqualifications and debarment. The FDA may disqualify a clinical investigator from receiving investigational drugs, biologics, or devices if it determines the investigator repeatedly or deliberately violated the agency's regulations or has repeatedly or deliberately submitted false information to a sponsor or the FDA. The FDA will usually only start this process if subjects are under the care of the investigator would be or have been exposed to an unreasonable and significant risk, or subjects' rights would be or have been seriously compromised, or data integrity or reliability is or has been compromised. A disqualification proceeding may only be initiated by the FDA center having jurisdiction over the product used in the study inspected. Once initiated, there are essentially 3 outcomes possible: an informal meeting to present the FDA with more information and to ask for reconsideration, a consent agreement in which the investigator voluntarily agrees to stop acting as a PI, or proceeding to notice of an actual administrative hearing and a binding final decision on disqualification. In 2015, the FDA issued 3 notices of initiation of disqualification proceedings, 1 notice of an opportunity for a hearing, and 2 consent agreements for full disqualification. The FDA may also debar a person from participating in FDA-regulated activities due to a criminal conviction under federal or state law. Thankfully, depending on your perspective, this is not any federal or state law. It's those seen as relevant to the FDA's purpose, and so generally only includes felonies under federal law for conduct relating to the development of a drug product, or a felony conviction under federal or state law that involves bribery, payment of illegal gratitudes, fraud, perjury, false statements, etc. Debarment can be mandatory, meaning essentially it's required if an FDA employee uncovers information that an individual has been convicted of a triggering criminal offense, but it can also be permissive, in which the person debarred is merely associated with somebody who was convicted. In all circumstances, debarment requires a formal regulatory hearing. Next. The FDA is permitted to enter and inspect at reasonable times, within reasonable limits, and in a reasonable manner, establishments or vehicles used to process, hold, or transport food, drugs, devices, tobacco products, or even cosmetics. Reasonable is not a legally defined term, but the FDA generally interprets it to mean what is reasonably necessary to achieve the objective. Inspectors are instructed to proceed with diplomacy, tact, and persuasiveness in all inspections. Domestic inspections must start with presentation of the inspector's credentials and provision of written notice provided to the top official available. Prior notice of the inspection will generally be provided, but it does not have to be, and inspectors are advised to keep the time frame between initial contact and the actual inspection as short as possible, and not more than 5 calendar days. The purpose of this prior notice is to facilitate the inspection process and ensure the appropriate records and personnel will be available. It is not meant as a request for an appointment to inspect. Inspectors, once on site, are not authorized to sign or agree to any document presented to them, such as a waiver of liability for physical injury, a confidentiality agreement, or an agreement to put in writing all requests for information and data during the inspection. Next. The degree and depth of an inspection depends on the information desired and/or the violation suspected to be encountered. In making this determination, inspectors are asked to weigh the site's current compliance program, the nature of the inspection, general knowledge of the industry and its problems, the site's history, and any conditions found as the inspection progresses. Except for the issuance of official forms or documents, an inspector is generally not at liberty to release or divulge any information to this site that is obtained during the inspection, including information contained in field diaries and field notes. Although an inspector's authority when on site is broad, it is not without limits. An inspector cannot generally review financial information, personnel data, except that necessary to check qualifications, or research data that is unrelated to the purpose of the FDA's inspection. An inspector may request to take photographs and will represent that he/she has the authority to do so. Inspectors are directed to review at a minimum records confirming study-related administrative information, so lists of all studies, delegations of tasks, and training, protocol-specific information such as versioning, study procedures, and deviations, IRB information like the name of the IRB, provision of the IRB approvals and all IRB correspondence, human subjects records such as informed consent, the source documents, and the case report forms, and any initial and ongoing relevant financial disclosures. Inspectors are generally asked to hold daily conversations regarding the progress of their work in order to minimize surprises, errors, and misunderstandings. This may include reporting of observations of questionable significance, and any discussion around these issues must generally be memorialized in the inspection report. These means are supposed to allow the site to ask questions, seek clarity, and even explain corrective actions that have been or will be taken during the inspection process. Prior to leaving the site, the inspector must notify site management in writing of any observed objectionable conditions or other violations by issuing a 483. These observations must be listed in order of significance and include a citation to the applicable laws or regulations they pertain. The final discussion with management before leaving the site is meant to be frank, courteous, and responsive. Inspectors are advised to not be overbearing or arbitrary in their attitude or actions, and to not argue with management, and to emphasize that any findings observed may be determined by the FDA as a violation only after reviewing all the facts. Next. The inspector, once leaving the site, is responsible for completing an Establishment Inspection Report, or EIR, which is then reviewed by the district office and center. This report is formalized and includes the following sections: a narrative summary, administrative data, site history, site designation of responsibility and the persons interviewed, objectionable conditions and the management's response, supporting evidence and relevance, discussions with management, any additional information, any voluntary corrections, and all exhibits and attachments. The inspector also recommends a classification of the inspection as either no action indicated, voluntary action indicated, or official action indicated. No action indicated requires no additional action by the site or the FDA. Voluntary action indicated requires no additional action by the FDA, assuming the site completes its voluntary corrective actions, which are likely to be reviewed during the next inspection. In this circumstance, any regulatory violations uncovered during the inspection are considered few and not likely to seriously impact participant safety or data integrity. Official action indicated means additional enforcement is necessary and likely to occur. In this circumstance, the violations uncovered are considered repeated, deliberate, and or significant in that the rights, safety, or welfare of participants are not being adequately protected or data integrity has been compromised. If official action is indicated, the expectation is that generally the first step will be to issue a warning letter. The FDA will consider before issuing this warning letter the site's compliance history, the nature of the violations, the risks associated with the regulated product, the adequacy of the firm's corrective actions, whether documentation of these corrective actions are provided, whether a time frame has been provided for these corrective actions, and whether progress is consistent with that time frame. If a warning letter is not issued, the FDA should provide a formal response letter indicating the agency's decision to rely on the site's actions and/or promises to date. The district office has 15 working days after the inspection to recommend a warning letter to the reviewing center, which then has an additional 15 working days to notify the office whether it agrees. A site's response to a warning letter will result in official acknowledgement from the agency, but the matter is not considered resolved until a closeout letter is issued. A closeout letter will only be issued once the FDA is satisfied the corrective actions taken are sufficient and has verified they have been made, usually through the performance of another inspection. From that point, the FDA has 65 working days to issue the closeout letter, which seems like an extraordinarily long time to wait. A closeout letter does not relieve the recipient from the responsibility to maintain sustained compliance. And interestingly, and somewhat ominously, FDA SOPs indicate that warning letters should not typically be issued more than one time for the same or similar findings, meaning that if a future inspection shows similar problems, the FDA will probably raise its enforcement efforts. Next. And with that, I'd like to conclude. I hope that gives you a general overview of the FDA's approach to inspections, and I'd like to turn it over to Terry Stubbs to show you her in-life experience helping sites navigate FDA inspections.
Thanks, Dominic. Presentation was excellent. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do is start something. When I found out that I was going to be doing this, I decided I wanted to do this in a little different way because I have a long history of being in the industry and had my very first audit the day after I got notified for Joan if I would like to do this speaking. So it was kind of apropos. What I decided to do was start from a proactive, because I think it's very important, since sites have a lot of information to go by, but really don't know where to start. So with the proactive, we're going to learn and teach your staff. I think it's important with us. We have meetings every 6 to 8 weeks, and we use different topics to speak about. And one of the topics that's very important for you to use with your staff is teaching them about the FDA. There are literally hundreds of pieces of information on the internet, and you can teach your team the importance of what an FDA audit means. Next slide, please. You want to go to the FDA website. One of the pieces of information that I did get from my audit were places to go and look for information on exactly what happens when you have an audit, what the reviewers are looking at. There's this wonderful manual called the Compliance Program Guide Manual for FDA staff, and it's going to be used for investigators as well as sponsor investigators, and you can peruse through it, and it'll basically tell you what they're going to be looking for when they come. Check it out, get a copy, and teach your staff with it. That's what we're doing. Next slide. First things first, you want to focus on quality. Throughout your entire time of doing research, some sites don't have any QC or QM, quality management, quality control. It's really important that you have a system set up. So the first person who enters the data is checked by a second person, making sure everything is able to be understood. What I teach at my office, if you get an FDA audit, they are supposed to be able to come and see everything and not have to ask questions. The documents should be able to be self-explanatory, so someone can look at it and understand everything that's in it. If they can't understand it, then they're going to ask questions. So if your staff has the same idea when they're looking at source documents or regulatory documents, or notes to file, drug accountability, if it's able to be understood, then you'll probably be okay. If it isn't able to be understood, then you want to give it to somebody else in the office and say, this is what I mean, please read this, see what this says. And if they say, I don't understand, then you need to document it more clearly. Next slide, please. Do you have standard operating procedures, SOPs, for your research site? The reason I bring this up is because many sites don't have them. In the state of Massachusetts, we get a yearly IRB audit, as the state requires that in their documentation with central IRBs. So with that, it just means someone comes to the site and they look over, make sure the staff is the same, the regulatory documents for the studies, and they also will look at your SOPs and other information that you have pertaining to your site. I have had someone who was getting an audit in Boston, and 2 days before they got the audit, didn't have any SOPs, and this was a large facility, who wanted to actually use our SOPs 2 days before the audit came. I was not comfortable with that, but did discuss that I could help if needed to be. So it's very important that you have SOPs. I was lucky enough, I don't even want to say this, but 22 years ago, to have John Isadora walking through my office for one of the IRB state audits, and came in and he said to me, you know what, I'm going to teach you about standard operating procedures for sites, and you're going to be one of the first sites in the U.S. to have them. So he sat down, he was wonderful, gave me all kinds of information, and we became auditors of our own site operating procedures, which he was lucky enough, I was lucky enough to have him review for me. With that, we now have them. We've had them for 22 years, but a lot of sites still don't have them. So if your answer is no, and you don't have any SOPs, which are your standard operating procedures, then you're in trouble before you even start your audit. You need to have SOPs. There are different places that you can go and get SOPs. I think even CenterWatch has them listed for purchase now. You can modify them to make them site-specific, but you definitely need to have SOPs. Next slide, please. Once you have your SOPs, this is the other thing that John was wonderful enough to teach me, is you've got to follow those SOPs closely. The SOPs will be requested, and during the audit that we had, it was the second day, he came to me and said, I need to see your SOPs. And then he said, I need to see how closely you follow your SOPs, and your staff follows your SOPs. So it is very important that what is in your SOPs is what your staff understands and follows. In our office, all of our new employees, when they come in, they actually have to sit down with the SOPs, and we have a paper that they sign that allows us to prove that we have given them the SOPs, that they have read the SOPs, and they understand the SOPs. The FDA's job is to see what you have for SOPs and review how closely your staff follows your SOPs. And they do this. That did happen to us. So if you have your SOPs, nobody knows what they're about, nobody's read them, and nobody follows them, that's as bad as not having SOPs. Important to make sure that you educate your SOPs to your staff, and if you add or change your SOPs, that you let your staff know what has been added or changed through emails or at meetings. Next slide, please. Create and review your own company SOPs and update them as needed. You will be needing to update them because things change. Make sure that your systems of operations are practical and not rigid. This was another guideline that John gave me. The more rigid and strict your systems of operation are, the less likely your staff is going to follow them. So just like the FDA guidelines are there to guide you, your SOPs are there for guiding instructions on certain things that you do. The most important SOP that you probably will have in there will be informed consent. How is that process? What does it look like? How is it done within your office? Every single piece of what happens in the informed consent process needs to be documented in those SOPs, and it needs to make sure, you need to make sure that your staff is following them and doing what your SOPs say. The more exact they are, again, the less likely your staff is going to be able to follow them. And that means the more problems you're going to have during an audit, because they're going to point out how your staff isn't following your SOPs to the letter of the law. Next slide, please. Your site staff is not aware of your SOPs. I have been at many meetings through the past 12, 15 years and found out that people have SOPs, but the only people who know about the SOPs is the regulatory people, that the physicians or the staff doesn't know anything about the SOPs. So obviously, they're not going to be closely following them. If that happens, and that is the case in your site, you will be in trouble when you have an FDA audit, because you will not have staff that is trained in your SOPs, and when asked questions from FDA monitors, it will be apparent that they don't know the SOPs. Next slide, please. So here comes the fun part. You've been notified you're going to be receiving an FDA audit. You can get the notification in several ways. One can be a phone call. We're going to be coming to your site. We're confirming your address. 2, an email, or you can have both. In our case, we had both. We had a phone call, and then we got an email to confirm the phone call. Most sites go into a panic mode. We weren't into a panic mode, but we were uncomfortable because we'd never had one of these. So staff was very nervous about what would be occurring and what it would look like. In the case when you get notified like this, if you panic, so will your entire staff. So mine is, don't panic, just kind of chill out and figure out what we need to do. Next slide, please. Here is the most important question you can ask. Once you know you've been selected, you need to ask during your initial notice, in a phone call or through email, is this a for-cause audit, a causal audit, or a not-for-cause audit? In our particular case, it was just a random audit, not for cause, which makes you breathe a little bit easier when you hear that information. And we were also told once the investigator came in, that it was due to over-recruitment on one of the trials we did. So if you're one of those sites who your staff is excited and motivated about over-recruitment, you just need to realize if you are one of the top recruiters, you could get a not-for-cause audit. So make sure when you're doing the studies that you're doing that your data is clean. Next slide, please. This is so important because your next steps are going to be to inform the CRO and notify the sponsor. They're going to ask you what exactly was said. Is it a for-cause off? When is it coming? When is it happening? And they will need to understand what's going on and why. So the information that you get from those simple questions is important so you can understand what the FDA auditor is going to be reviewing and why he's reviewing it. The sponsor and the CRO will ask you. You need to make sure that if you notify the CRO, that you have notification from the CRO to the sponsor that they have also been notified, especially if your contract states that the sponsor has to be notified first and then the CRO. So once you know that you're having one coming and an audit is on its way, you need to look and see what your contract states and then make sure you follow the guidelines for that. Next slide, please. You know they're coming. In our case, we know they're coming, and we know why they're coming. So we begin to gather everything, the documents that are going to be needed. We're gathering the subject source documents, the regulatory binders, if there's any diaries, if there's any medication left at site, study medication, that has to be there. Sometimes there is with generic trials. Any correspondence, any and all emails will be in the regulatory binder anyway, but you want to make sure for sure that it's all in there. So you want to check your correspondence emails with what's in the reg binder to make sure that if there's anything missing, it goes in there. The temp logs, anything that comes from the CRO for the monitor visits, closeout visit. In this particular case, the study for us was closed a year ago at the IRB. So we had closeout letters and information from the CRO and the IRB. They're going to look at temp logs. They're going to look where the drug is stored. They're going to take a little tour of your office, and all this information is going to be needed. One of the things that you should know about the temperatures, the min-maxes, is oftentimes those little things expire on a yearly basis. So if you flip it over during your audit and find out that the temp log has expired and it hasn't been recalibrated, that could be a problem for you. We didn't have that problem, but the inspector did say a lot of sites don't check the temp logs and they don't check the dates on the temp logs to see if they're still okay to be used. We actually, for the smaller ones, we don't calibrate them. We just purchase a new one. It's less expensive to purchase a new temp log, the min-maxes, than it is actually to have them calibrated. So be prepared for all the things that are going to be required and asked of you. Next slide, please. The sponsor or the CRO may wish to come and review the study before the FDA auditor comes to your site. Once you've notified them, we actually do it via email, and then we do it via a phone call to ensure that it got where it's supposed to go. They will instruct you on what will be happening next. In this case, the sponsor did not wish to come, and the CRO did a webinar with us because the study that we had was a short study. It was only a 2-week study. There wasn't too much involved, so the webinar was their way to ensure that we were ready for the audit. Next slide, please. The FDA auditor has arrived. What's going to happen when the FDA auditor comes? The FDA is going to walk through the door, and they're going to first walk into your waiting room. From information I have learned within the industry, that's the first place that we begin to look at things to see what's happening. So we kept no other study information in the waiting room, no other study materials, no recruitment materials, nothing that related to any other clinical trials was in the waiting room when the FDA auditor arrived. We request a form of ID before allowing the auditor on site. They may come in a uniform, they may not be in a uniform, but they always have to have ID. So the first thing you're going to do is ask them for the ID, make sure that the picture matches the person standing in front of you, and then also make sure that if they don't have an ID, they're actually not allowed onto your site. So you have to be aware of that. If you're letting an auditor come in and there's no ID to prove they are an FDA auditor, that's going to be trouble for you later. You're going to review. You're going to get a little form once they come through the door and you sit down with them. They will have a form they will hand you. It's called the 482. That form is documentation that an FDA auditor is going to begin to audit your site. It will have the physician's name on it, who is the PI, and the address and any information, and it is also signed by the auditor, and it has the date that the audit will begin. It's very important that you check this to ensure that your PI name is correct and so is your address. If not, you want to let the auditor know that there's some typos on it and it needs to be corrected. That form is going to be copied and original stays on site. Next, please. Ensure that the space that you are about to have an audit to occur in is private and it's away from the daily office grind. So this is kind of before the audit's going to be happening. It's very important that this space is very, very private, away from what's going on in your office. So the auditor will have time to do what they need to do without having the regular workload that's going on in the office to an earshot of what's happening. So for us, we have a private office that's set away from the hustle and the bustle of the rest of the office. And everything was moved out of the office from the employee who usually got to share that office and set up just for the auditor to be able to come. So for HIP, we set up only the study documents that were selected for this audit trial. And that's all what was in that room. It included study materials, the source documents for the subjects that were in the trial, all regulatory documents, drug logs, correspondence logs, anything at all related to that clinical trial was in there. We brought the auditor to the private room to ensure privacy from the working staff. And in our office, the walls have a tendency to be thin because it's a newer office. So we played soft classical music in the background in an office nearby, so it would muffle the conversations that would be happening throughout the office with the rest of the working staff. And that's very, very important. Next slide, please. This is also really important. If you have 3 or 4 people who are the face to the auditor when they come to do the audit, that could be very confusing and a lot of assumptions could be made from that. So in our office, I decided that I was going to be the contact person because I had, 1, never been through an audit, and 2, I wanted to see what went on. So I was the assigned person at this time. And they will actually, when they send you an email, they will request who is going to be the assigned person. So for this particular audit, it was me, and I learned a lot for sure. This person, which is me, will also be collecting documents and answering questions that are asked. When I needed documents collected, I would go to the staff and actually ask them to make copies for me. There was much copying being completed for regulatory. A lot of documents that were collected had to do with CRO and sponsor, some of ours that are normal 1572s. But there are a lot of documents that they do collect. And they can collect any documents they want to. They can also collect complete source documents with volunteer information on them. They don't have to redact them. They can take them as is because they have the rules and regulations to be able to do that. It's okay when you're having your questions and answer time. If you're not sure of something, it is much better to say, you know what, I need to check on that and get back with you. I'm not quite sure, and I don't want to give you information that isn't correct. And go and find out the answers to whatever the questions were. A perfect example is looking at a CV, and he looked at a CV and saw that someone had some training. And he asked about the CEUs for that training and what that training entailed. So I had to go to the person whose CV it was and ask about that and get that information and actually get the certificate of the training to ensure that he had that information. It's very important that you be honest, and it's very important that you make eye contact when answering questions. In the particular case for us, the coordinator who is doing the trial and one of the sub-investigators were also brought in for a short period of time and asked questions. Probably I think it was on day 3 when he had looked through a lot of the stuff but had some questions that he needed answered. Our audit was actually a 5-day audit because we had 24 volunteers that had been randomized into the clinical trial. But how you respond and how you act is extremely important, so keep your cool and don't be nervous. Next slide, please. Don't chitter-chatter. It's very bad when you have an auditor to start chitter-chatting. There will be quiet pauses in conversation throughout the entire audit time. I had him in a little room where he had the whole world to himself, but I could hear if he needed me, and he would come and get me. If he was questioning me or asking me different things about things within the office or people that were in the trial, I would answer the questions, and that would be it. I did not have chitter-chatter. Chitter-chatter can happen when people are very, very nervous. It's very common for people to be totally nervous when there's quiet places in conversation and people try to speak up and fill them. You don't want to do that when you have an FDA auditor. It doesn't need to be filled with words. You just want to enjoy the quiet pauses and don't make anything of them and don't appear to be nervous. And chitter-chatter will make you appear very nervous. So remember to be professional and calm. Next slide, please. The primary investigator will need to be on site for the first day. They will tell you it's up to you, who do you want to be there. But if you haven't done anything wrong and you want it to go smoothly, you want to make sure that the primary investigator is there to say hello sometime within the first day. And on the final day to review audit findings, it's very important that you have your PI there for that. Otherwise, that could also be an issue. The auditor will share with the investigator and the staff what was done right. And that's always kind of nice. It's nice to hear, okay, regulatory binders are clean and great. For the most part, everything here looks pretty good. I have one little quick question. Here's what I would recommend that you do. But other than that, there will be no 483. And that makes everyone extremely happy when you hear that. They'll also give you little tips. The next time you do something like this, a study like this, you may want to consider doing this or that or the other. One of the great little tips that he gave me was when we had SAEs that occurred during the trial, to ensure if we were reporting them to the sponsor if we were reporting them to the CRO, that we had an email from the sponsor to let us know that we got it. So they would he said I would recommend that you have the CRO contact the sponsor in an email and then send you a copy of it so you have documentation and you know that the sponsor was actually notified. Next slide, please. The FDA Classifications of Inspections, no action. Nothing happens, no paperwork. Voluntary action. You may get a little letter telling you that you need to make some changes or corrections. And then, of course, the official action and indication, which nobody wants to have, and the warning letters with the 483 forms. I remember being at some conferences, and there was one site who had that was doing a presentation, and they had in 4 years 7 actual FDA audits. The first study they came in, they found findings, and then they went back month after month, and he literally had 6 months worth of auditing going on from FDA. He learned a lot, but I'm sure it was very stressful. Next slide, please. You need to inform your IRB after the audit has occurred, unless there's major stuff, you need to do it right during the audit. But if there's not anything major, you need to just inform your IRB that there was an FDA audit, and the only notification that we have to let you know is that on the final letter that came from the CRO, there was saying there were no adverse events. There were 2 adverse events. So there was a typo in that letter. Any missed or found information during the audit, if there's anything major, obviously you have to let your IRB know about those things. But it is good to let them know you've had an audit, you've completed it, and there were no findings, or there were findings and what they were. Next slide, please. If a 483 is going to be given to your site, usually the auditor will let you know right then and there. We believe your site is going to get a 483. Your site is going to get a 483. We're pretty positive your investigator is going to get a 483. Usually when they leave, you will know if a 483 is coming or will be given to you, depending on the discrepancies and what happens. Sometimes what happens during FDA audits is they will go in and they will tell the investigator that a 483 is going to happen. And usually at some sites, it means that the coordinator will be fired instantly. But that's what I've heard from other sites has happened to them. Anyway, since we haven't had one of these, and I don't really want to ever get one of these, and hopefully neither do any of you, you just want to make sure that if you do get one, you are following up, and there is written documentation, and it's done in a timely manner. Don't ignore it. It's not going to go away. You need to deal with it right away as quickly as you can, and you need to deal with it in writing. If there is some kind of a weird circumstance or a misunderstanding, then you do have time to respond to it and let others know exactly what has happened. What is expected and needed is going to be explained in the letter from the FDA. They're going to tell you how long that you have to respond to it, and if you don't, they'll tell you what will be happening next. So just realize, if you're new at this, don't ignore your Form 483 if you get one. And I think the next slide is open for questions. So if there are any questions, there you go. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. That was an awesome presentation. We did have one question come in for Terry. Could you please repeat where you can purchase the standard operating procedure templates online?
CenterWatch has a whole set that you can purchase for, I think it's a whole book that you purchase on how to create SOPs.
I can send follow-up information on that. Thank you, Terry.
You're welcome.
So, Terry, great presentation, Terry and Dominic. I learned a lot. It was very, very insightful, very informative. Terry, would you have any insights or tips on when you work with your staff on how to alleviate their concerns? Because I can only imagine when you receive a notice that you're going to be audited, that there's going to be a high level of anxiety within your staff. How do you work with them to kind of calm that anxiety, their concerns, and keep them motivated?
What I usually do is sit down with those who are involved. That's what I did this time, and say, okay, we're not going to go into panic mode because that won't help any of us, and it might make us make more mistakes and not have prepared what we need prepared. So we sat down with the team and myself, And I said, I am going to be very calm. You don't have to stress out in public. If you need to stress out personally or on your own, you're welcome to do that. But when the auditor is here, I'm asking you to not show stress and actually stay within your area and do not come into the area where we're having the audit until you are totally calm and collected. So I gave them time to be stressed out and nervous on their own away from the auditor. And there were times when the auditor did ask to speak with them, and I would bring them in and tell them, because the auditor was nice enough to say, I have a couple questions, here's what they are, and could you please bring this staff member? So I would bring the staff member in, and they would have their discussion, and then the staff member would go back. So it's just a matter of how the person who's in charge responds. And again, if you respond with chaos and stress, your whole staff is going to respond that way, and it's just going to be a mess and just unneeded things that you don't really need. So basically, it's whoever is leading has to be calm and then has to do the calming for the rest of the staff because they were nervous and afraid also.
And then my last question, if there's no other questions from the audience, you mentioned you have the opportunity, Terry, to invite a sponsor or CRO, and they can individually make a choice to be on site. Do you often also invite the IRB representative to be there while the FDA auditor?
No. Usually what happens is you call the CRO and the sponsor, and it's their decision if they want to come. I'm not inviting them. Sometimes they will come and they will ask to peruse through everything before the FDA comes. Sometimes they will ask to stay on site, but that's usually only at a site that understands it has problems. Normally, they'll just come, look at everything, and leave before the audit occurs. IRBs, not usually. It's not standard of practice to have the IRB there unless you're at a teaching university and using your own hospital IRB. And in that case, they would probably also be involved in the investigation, so they would want to be there.
Yeah, and I can speak to that. I actually worked at a teaching hospital before, and we had investigators tell the IRB that they weren't invited. So it's always kind of interesting to see. But there is different overlapping authorities, and that the FDA can also choose to inspect the IRB, and they may very well do so based on what they find at the site if the two are of the same institution. But typically those have different subjects and different compliance programs completely.
Great, thank you. And we actually do have time for one more question. If we didn't answer your question over the webinar, we will send you follow-ups in a blog post. But this one is probably for Terry on the site side. Do you cancel any patient visits if visit windows allow during the audit?
No. What we actually did is we let the auditor know that the coordinator who was on that trial actually has some clinical visits that are going to be occurring, and is there a particular time that he will need her, and exactly how much time will he need of her? And he will answer. He answered, I will need her at the closeout, and I will need her for about 20 minutes then. And during, if I need her, I can let you know that I might need her for another 20-minute slot. So I would explain to him when her patient schedules were, what they looked like, and what time was available, and he would pick the time that was best for him, and then I would let her know. So we didn't cancel patient visits or volunteer visits or any of our normal activity because we had an area where it was private for him to be in and away from all the clinical stuff.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. Well, that seems to be all the time we have today. This was recorded, so we will send you a follow-up email later today with the link to the recording. And like I said before, all your questions will be answered in a follow-up blog post. So thank you again to our speakers, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Georgia. Thank you, Dominic and Terry.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you.